we have been blinded by our own Western centrism, Eurocentrism. So we were not critical towards the kind of particularity this kind of thought comes from. And it's not anything bad about coming from a European tradition, right?
We are on air now, so welcome to Podcastocracy Worldwide Deliberation. This podcast episode is recorded as part of the project Central European Memory of the Holocaust in a multicultural and multidimensional perspective. In this episode, we will explore the topic of decolonization of the deliberative democracy. And our today's guest is Dr. Hans Assenbaum, a senior researcher at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Thank you very much for joining us. It's an honor to speak with you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm excited about this conversation.
To start, tell me the purpose and activity of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and the Global Governance at the University of Canberra.
Yeah, sure. So the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance is, I think we can proudly say, the world leading center on deliberative democracy. We do all kinds of research on deliberative democracy, which basically is an ideal of democracy that understands democracy not as a voting process primarily, but primarily as a deliberative process, a process of conversations. And it puts forward the ideal that these conversations, this way of reason giving, of explaining what you want and why you want it and what other people might want, should be inclusive and egalitarian. So it should include as many affected people as possible. And it should also treat these people equally in this kind of conversation. And we do lots of research around these ideas. So for example, you can think of deliberative democracy in a forum. Mini publics are very popular today, citizens' juries, all kinds of different types, citizens' assemblies, and so on. So if you look at these forums that try to realize this ideal of deliberative democracy, for example, our center measures how deliberative the conversations are, so how inclusive they are, whether people are listening to each other, with the deliberative reason index that Simon Niemeyer developed. If, on the other hand, you understand deliberation in more systemic terms, so when you think about deliberative systems, deliberation happens everywhere, in every talk, through journalistic conversations, publications, through activism. Then, for example, the project on democratic resilience, which is led by our center director, Selen Ercan, is really interesting in studying how extremist attacks threaten democracy and how deliberative responses can look like in terms of a deliberative system. Of course, our center also is leading in looking at ecological questions. Here, the work of Jean Dreisig is leading in thinking about a green democracy and expanding this kind of thought, thinking about non-human, so how non-human nature can participate in democracy. And finally, a last point to introduce our center. The center is very impact-oriented, so we're trying to make real-world differences by not only studying, but also inventing new forms of democracy. For example, we are currently working with the Australian Museum, the Museum for Australian Democracy, where we put together workshops on multiculturalism and the question of belonging in Australian society. And we get together with multicultural communities to deliberate about how they feel their sense of belonging in Australia, how we can improve this kind of sense of belonging. This work is led by Adele Webb. And so we are very impact-oriented as well.
Thank you very much for the introduction of your center. And now I would like you to discuss the issue of decolonization and from a comparative perspective in relation to the very influential debate that you as the center conducted and published in the paper Decolonization of Deliberative Democracy, a Debate. Could you elaborate?
Yes, of course. So I think deliberative democracy has for a long time been not aware of its own colonial legacies, right? Of course, we fight for this idea of deliberative democracy, inclusive reason giving, treating everybody equally, including everybody in these kind of conversations. And I think for a long time, we have been blinded by our own Western centrism, Eurocentrism. So we were not critical towards the kind of particularity this kind of thought comes from. And it's not anything bad about coming from a European tradition, right? So the European Enlightenment movement, the idea that reason giving, that rationality are important, that we need to justify our reasons towards others. None of this is bad at all. What it needs, though, is a reflection on the particularity of these ideas. They come from a particular global context. They come from a particular geographic and cultural context. And I think we've sometimes, as deliberative Democrats, been ignorant towards this particularity and what we can learn from other cultures. So what our center tries to do is to facilitate a conversation maybe rather than leading and steering the conversation ourselves. We are seeing ourselves as providing an infrastructure in the position of inviting other people to speak about these topics. So in this spirit, we have put together the paper that you mentioned. And the idea for this paper was not for one person to say, this is how deliberation, how decolonizing deliberative democracy works, but rather to facilitate a conversation, to bring different voices together, to hear from different people in different global contexts what they think about whether deliberative democracy can be decolonized. And we put this kind of provocative, pointed question, can deliberative democracy be decolonized, forward with Friedel Marquardt, who has co-edited this paper together with me. And we collect different responses to this question, from more positive to more negative. And people like Genevieve Fujii-Johnson argue convincingly that deliberative democracy cannot be decolonized because it is so deeply rooted in Western thinking, thinking pattern, Western ideologies that are so closely intertwined with colonialism. So if we think about the Enlightenment movement, while we can support many of the emancipatory ideas, they are still closely intertwined with the history of colonialism. And so she comes to the conclusion that you cannot separate the racist colonial ideologies from the ones that have led to the ideal of deliberative democracy. And of course, there are more positive views as well. Nicole Curato in the paper takes a more positive angle and makes the case for global deliberation, and that global deliberation across cultural differences is possible without eradicating these differences, but respecting difference and deliberating across differences. And so we have different responses, and I think the paper is really nice in giving a broad angle rather than prescribing one way how to do it, rather giving various answers and bringing these various answers together.
It's very interesting and inspiring point of view and whole field of research. Yes, and I would like you to elaborate on the theoretical framework for the colonization of deliberative democracy that you wrote with Ricardo Fabriano Mendoza. I'm interested especially in your sixth step of decolonization.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ricardo and I made an attempt at putting forward a framework for decolonizing deliberative democracy as a kind of contribution to the debate rather than a definite answer. But we thought about not what a decolonized deliberative democracy would look like, because we cannot know that, but rather we thought about what could be the steps that theorists, and this is really focused on the angle for deliberative democratic theorists, what they could do to decolonize deliberative democracy. So we put forward these 6 moves to decolonize deliberative democracy. The three first moves are deconstructive. So we first make the argument that we need to deconstruct deliberative democracy as it exists today, before then in the second three moves to reconstruct it from a decolonizing angle. That doesn't mean destructing deliberative democracy, but rather having a kind of like an iterative process of deconstruction and reconstruction. So these six moves entail first acknowledging the violence of modernity. So acknowledging that our knowledge systems that we mostly use in deliberative democracy are Western-centric, and that the ignorance of this particularity that I mentioned earlier, right? The ignorance only on the fact that it's a particular thinking and philosophical system, this already inflicts violence because it silences knowledges and knowledge systems, epistemologies from the global South, from the majority world, from different cultural contexts, right? So acknowledging the violences. Then the second move would be to recognize the epistemic injustices in the knowledge production about deliberative democracy. So if we look at our academic communities, who is producing the ideal of deliberative democracy? Where does it come from? And is the knowledge production on deliberative democracy equal around the globe? And of course, we easily recognize the deep inequalities between global South and global North, how global North centric it is. For example, if you look at Participedia, a fantastic project, an online database that collects different instances of participatory deliberative democracy around the world, you will recognize that global North cases are much more often recorded. And that is not because it doesn't happen in the global South. That's because this is where the resources are. This is where the money is. This is where the good academic positions are. And there are also obviously language barriers, because a global North language, English, is the dominant language in academia. So after we recognize these epistemic injustices, we need to move to also criticize the colonial drive in some of these democratic innovations, because we are ignorant to the particularity of our own cultural framing of deliberative democracy. Democratic innovations are often exported. They are created in the global North and then exported to majority world countries with the assumption that this is a recipe that will work anywhere in any cultural context. So they are not context sensitive. And in doing so, while doing this with a good intention, they make a colonial move because they export these kind of democratic innovations in an ignorant way. So once we've criticized deliberative democracy in these three steps, we can start to reconstruct deliberative democracy in a different manner. And that doesn't mean that deliberative democracy isn't deliberative democracy anymore. We can keep the core ideal of inclusive reason giving, but we need to reconstruct this ideal together with social movements, with populations, with indigenous people from the global South. So the first step is actually starting with this ideal of deliberative democracy in the background, but not starting, from the theories of Habermas and establishing Habermas as the number one, authority to go to, but just starting with this background ideal of deliberative democracy and then engaging with people from the majority world, especially indigenous communities, and constructing a new version of deliberative democracy. And then the next step we suggest would be engaging in a dialogue with the Global South scholarship. So again, highlighting how Global North centric our scholarship on deliberative democracy is. There is so much interesting and deep work in majority world countries that we are mostly ignorant of, partly also because it's in different languages that we Global North scholars don't understand. So engaging with this kind of work, bringing it into conversation with the bottom-up reconstruction of deliberative ideals. And finally, as the sixth and final move, refocusing on emancipation as a core ideal of deliberative democracy. We put this as a last step because it's also as somewhat an ideal. The ideal of emancipation itself is rooted in global North, in Western ideas and knowledge systems. But we think that this idea has been strong at the beginning of deliberative democracy and has gotten a little bit lost. So reconnecting to the radical, to the more critical angles of deliberative democracy, we think is a productive step. Final step to decolonize deliberative democracy.
Next topic, I would like to touch up on more open and democratic engagement with the Global South and the majority world scholarship. Could you tell something more about it in the both contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are well, there are different sources. There's Global South Scholarship, and as I highlighted, it's often language barriers. So maybe it's up to Global North scholars to learn different languages. There's also a politics of citations. So who do we cite, right? For example, do we only cite English-speaking sources? So making a case of using sources from other languages as well, from scholars who haven't been translated to English. Also, for example, using direct quotes, we are used to that any quote that we read in an article in a research paper is translated to English, but maybe using them in the original language and putting the burden of translation on Global North people for a change. Also translating Global South literature, published articles maybe into English so that they are accessible to a broader audience. So there's the angle of engaging with Global South scholarship, but then there's also these ideas of theorizing with indigenous groups, with social movements, with groups from the Global South. That might even include refugees in our own countries, in Global North countries. So I put forward a method that I call democratic theorizing, where the idea of democratic, making theorizing democratic is that it is an inclusive participatory process engaging with social movements, with people outside academia. So I think these kind of approaches, and there are lots of approaches here, and there's lots of debate happening here around engaged grounded theory, engaged normative theory. So there's lots to learn here. And I think indigenous knowledge systems play an important role here. And the engagement with people outside academia and social movements can be very enriching. And of course, we as researchers, as not only Global North researchers, but also as trained academic researchers, need to change our approach, our attitude. And key to that is to reflect on our positionality. So I do a lot of reflection on the privilege I hold as a white man from a Global North country. And I think it's a dialogue with ourselves to reflect on our positionality, but it's also a public dialogue with our readers, with our research participants, that we need to engage in and realize in the process of knowledge production that we are humble learners rather than the knowledge holders. I think there are often hierarchies in traditional approaches to research where the trained academic researchers perceive themselves as the knowledge holders because they have read and written so many books, and because they are the experts, the so-called experts in the field. But really, I think the everyday knowledge of people outside academia, of social movements, of marginalized groups, there is so much depth to this kind of knowledge and so much lived experience that our academic expertise is often missing, that there's lots to learn from there.
I can totally subscribe to this point of view, but moving on, what are your views on the ecology of knowledge and in relation to the theory of deliberative democracy?
The ecology of knowledge, I think, is a really important concept from indigenous theorizing, from decolonial approaches, that basically claims that there is not one superior knowledge system, but there is many competing, partly compatible ideas of how the world works. And this goes far beyond our academic approaches. So we could, of course, think about different theoretical traditions within our own disciplines, and that is partly it, but it goes much further to think of different epistemologies, how we can make sense of the world. For example, indigenous approaches hold that land itself is an epistemology, so we can understand land as a teacher, and land is not only, as probably our Western understandings would frame it, as an entity that is there to be, used, potentially exploited, but rather land entails all the life that happens on land. So it entails the water, the sky, the clouds, the winds, the weathers, the animals, the plants, and so on. So everything is an ecology that can teach us and that we can learn from. And we can learn not only by reading books, but also by experiencing, by touching, by smelling, by tasting, a multisensory approach to knowledge. So the ecology of knowledge brings together different ideas, different epistemologies, different ways of knowing, and basically explains that they are not, they don't need to be compatible, but they all can exist, and they are all, to a certain extent, equally valid. And that then opens the door to, I guess, not only including majority world knowledges, but also diminishing maybe our own Western arrogance about the knowledges and the approaches we hold.
And what if we were to reconsider the idea of deliberative democracy now? What is necessary in practice, and what we need? What is necessary in theory, from your perspective, right now, after the researches you've conducted?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a really interesting one. It's also a big one, and certainly many people might have different ideas. I think one thing that I think is missing, or at least underdeveloped, in our conceptions of democratic innovations, of deliberative democracy, is lived experience. And I'm working together with Sonia Busu from the University of Birmingham and several other fantastic collaborators on a project thinking about lived experience in deliberative democracy, democratic innovations, because our conceptions are often very expert-centric, right? So we think there is academic expertise, and that often sets the tone in deliberative forums, often dominates without us knowing, without us reflecting on this kind of domination. So like with decolonizing, I think it needs a sensitivity to the domination that is happening. And then it's not about disciplining or fighting, I think, about what is the superior knowledge, but it's about bringing the different knowledges together. So what role does lived experience play rather than expert knowledge? How do we feel about things? What are the emotions, the passions that we experience during deliberative processes, but also outside, that we bring to these deliberative processes? So I think that is one angle that is underdeveloped. And another point, and there's lots of debate around that, actually, is about more than human participation and the more than human world that we are living in, always have been living in, but increasingly realizing that, and that also is part of the decolonizing angle, I think, that we actually had the arrogance, not only global north to global south, but also as human beings, the kind of anthropocentrism, that we always perceive ourselves as the center of the world, and really we're such a tiny population among all the other animals, the plants, the microbes, the fungi, the forests, the technologies, the objects, the materialities that all participate in democracy. So I think we need to develop greater sensitivity for our more than human surroundings and participants that are always already part of the participatory processes, how to enhance their voices, and also how to reduce, and again, that is the decolonizing ethos here, I think, how to reduce the kind of arrogance that we kind of developed as humans, to question our own positionality, question our own status, realize obviously that our doing has brought a lot of good things, but also has brought humanity, and not only humanity, but a lot of animal life on the planet, a lot of plants near to extinction, across extinction. So we need to realize our own destructive forces in order to move closer, I guess, towards this ideal of deliberative democracy, that we can be truly inclusive and develop democratic futures together.
And that's the beautiful message at the end of our meeting. And the last question, do you have any book recommendations for our viewers?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I prepared a couple. So this was more like, I mean, these are great books, and these are the books that I had in reach. So I thought I'll show a couple of them. Decolonizing Politics, I think, is a great start for anybody interested in decolonizing politics, democracy, deliberative democracy. And that's a rather new book. This is an older book, but I think it's kind of often overlooked, and I think it's really important as well, The Secret History of Democracy, where we find many chapters about different democracy in different cultures, also prehistoric forms of democracy, not only in ancient Greece, but beyond. It helps us to realize how particular our Western version of democracy is. And then I think a strand of theory that I'm really interested in and that I find really helpful is New Materialism. So this is a great newer book on new materialism, because it helps us, I mentioned the more than human, it helps us realize all the materialities, the non-human entities that are present, that we are engaging with, and in this direction as well. A beautiful book that I think very well summarizes a lot of the theories of new materialism, that I found very readable, very accessible, very well written. So these are a couple of the books that I've read recently and that have inspired my thinking. There's lots of brilliant work out there, so lots of books to read, never enough time.
Thank you very much, Hans. Dr. Hans Assenbaum, Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Thank you very much for joining us. See you. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.